Good evening, everybody. You know who I am. Today, I want to talk, like I said, about the Russian invasion of Ukraine that's been going on for the last couple of months. And just to kind of get it out of the way right out the gate, I have family in Kharkiv who's being shelled. So if I come out a little hard on the Russians, that's why. That said, it's pretty obvious that like not every person in Russia necessarily aligns with their state. That's generally the case everywhere on planet Earth. Not everybody agrees with their governments. And there's a lot of times where, governments will do terrible things in the names of their people that their people wouldn't want done. So all of that said, let's talk. I'm going to try to, like I said, sort of dissociate myself from a little bit and just sort of put on my econ and strategy and sort of math goggles and try to understand what might be coming out of this based on sort of how we got here. So I know that we had originally talked about doing this back in middle of March, and it would have been a lot more innovative back in early March, but we've had a month now to see what the economic impact of this invasion has been. So a lot of this, you may recognize, but I hope to add a little bit of extra value along the way in terms of motivating why some of these things are happening. And what are the likely outcomes for them and what our policymakers are going to do as a result, which of course can provide useful financial information. Now that said, final disclosure, I'm not providing any kind of investment advice. Talk to your bankers, talk to your financial advisors, your salespeople, your fiduciaries, whoever handles your money. Don't listen to me. Right? Like that's the best thing I can say. Not because I don't trust my own analysis. I'll tell you what I invested in, but it's because I don't have a license to give you financial advice, and nor am I selling you anything. So all I am presenting is my perspective on this. So just to be perfectly clear with the disclosure and disclaimers. Okay, so the first question we ought to ask ourselves when trying to understand this situation is, why did Russia invade Ukraine in the first place? Because if we understand that, then we might be able to understand when this might come to an end and when the situation might start compounding. Because the situation is still live, still evolving, and it is still, very arguably getting worse. Therefore, we should understand exactly what motivates this. Now, the Kremlin hasn't exactly been forthcoming with identifying exactly what it wants to do. And most of what it has told us is, for lack of a better term, bullshit. They want to denazify Ukraine. Which is a little rich for reasons X, Y, Z, and I'm not going to bother engaging in, with government propaganda. It's not my job to drain the swamp on that. Nonetheless, most of the reasons that have been presented to us are in fact garbage. Now, that's usually the case, right? I'm not trying to make the case here that the Russian government is a specific kind of special liar or anything like that. Most governments don't tell you the truth about why they do something that's unpopular, like invading a neighboring country where large numbers of people speak the same language and follow the same religion. Generally speaking, in order to invade and conquer people, you've got to convince people to hate them, right? Like, think about how long it took the Nazis to convince the German people that Slavic people were less than dogs and had to be wiped out, right? That takes time. That's not the sort of thing that instantaneously comes around, right? So it takes a lot of sustained effort towards convincing people, especially who are neighbors effectively, to take up arms and fight one another. So we've got to really understand that there's got to be some pretty serious pressure on Russia to be able to make it want to take this particular step. Right. So if we think about ourselves from the positions of Russia, imagine you are the emperor of Russia. You are Catherine or Ivan or Alexander, pick your favorite czar. Right, you've got some very specific problems, and these are very well documented. A good place to get info on that, if you're interested, is this nice Cambridge History of Russia. Read books. Books are full of all kinds of useful things. In particular, it points out that one of the big problems the Russians have is that they are not geographically secure. Unlike a country like, say, the United States, which is surrounded by oceans and weaker powers, Russia has no natural barriers for the most part. Yes, there are the Urals that, you might say separate Asian from European Russia. But beyond that, Russia is kind of an easy cakewalk from a number of directions, right? Whether we're talking about, people riding in on the steppe, or we're talking about the Swedes invading, or the Germans, or the French, Russia doesn't have a lot of natural barriers or defenses. And so hundreds of years, Russia's national strategy has been to expand. right? And I don't mean endless expansion, but I mean expansion until you can hold more viable borders. Because a country that's sitting in the middle of an open field is waiting to be attacked by all of its neighbors, right? And this sort of history of people living on the steppe getting invaded by their neighbors goes back thousands of years, right? Like this is the natural problem of living on these territories. Historically, people solved it by just packing up and being nomads on horses, the Amnaya people, the Scythians, stuff like that. But once you start settling permanently, you run into this real problem of defensible borders. So let me show you one interesting sort of problem that we run into as Russia. So here, what I'm going to pull up is just an image of what's called the North European Plain. Right, the North European Plain is basically flat. There are some forests a little bit. There are a few rivers, but it's otherwise flat. And this makes this particular piece of land here an invasion superhighway. Right, this has been the path followed by Germany, followed by the Teutonic Knights, followed by France. The Swedes came in this way. So you've got this big sort of problem where you've got this funnel that starts off relatively tight over here and then opens wide up. Now, it's a little tricky to see on the map, but I'll try to trace where Russia's border is after the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? It's over here. So Russia's border is in the middle of a field with nothing to stop invaders from just sort of rolling in, right? Now, you might say, well, the Russians are armed with nuclear weapons. Yeah, and that's pretty much the only thing that has kept Russia from getting invaded by any kind of force. It's got to have a massive land force, and it's got to try to get as much strategic depth as possible. So Russia finds itself geopolitically in a position of needing to push outwards towards certain pinch points so that it can mass people on those pinch points instead of trying to hold an open border in the middle of a field. So here are in order, the Russian pinch points that need to be held. And again, this is to help explain why Russia's doing what Russia's doing so that we can make sense of all the fallout. One, you've got a gap here between the Caspian and the Urals, right, on the steppe. This is where the Mongols invade from and basically subjugate Russia for hundreds of years. So holding this particular gap is very important. Number two, you've got the Caucasus. This is the only one that has a physical barrier. The Caucasus Mountains are serious mountains. And that means if you can hold on either one side or the other, you basically have a gate, which is delightful for Russia's point of view. So they can't let go of the North Caucasus, even though these are definitely not Rus people who live there. The next thing that they have to hold is here, the Bessarabian Gap between the Carpathian Mountains and the Black Sea. This, since time immemorial, has been contested land. This is how actually the Persians invade to try to defeat the Scythians 2,500 years ago. This is regularly contested between the Russians and the Turks for hundreds of years. It's a very important particular piece of land. It's about 150 kilometers across between the mountains and the sea. So if you can hold this pinch point, it's great. Then the Carpathians swing up to here, and you'll notice that there's a point where this wide funnel sort of thins, and that's halfway across Poland. What's called the Vistula River. Now, that means that the ideal Russian border is not here at the border of Belarus and Ukraine, but is in fact about halfway through Poland. So if this sounds a little bit like, Stalin and Hitler carving up Poland, there's a reason that they picked the Vistula River as a nice dividing line, because it worked out okay for their security. So that's the fourth pinch point. And then the final pinch point that the Russians have to worry about is up here in the Baltics. This is particularly tricky for them because this is effectively what would have been considered a beachhead for invading Swedes hundreds of years ago during the Great Northern War. So the Russians are faced with this kind of difficult geography. Then on top of that, they have a problem with population. Russian population has peaked, is in decline, and has very serious problems with everything from drug-resistant tuberculosis, massive heroin addictions, alcoholism. There are all kinds of social problems that basically undermine and eat into Russia's population pyramid. Now, your population pyramid is important because demography is how you staff those pinch points. If you don't have a bunch of soldiers, you need a bunch of high-tech weaponry to force multiply those soldiers. And Russia did not succeed at making its jump into sort of future tech. It tried to do this over the last 15, 20 years. It made some investment in fancy kit that we've all seen and we were all mesmerized by. But interestingly enough, it's turned out that their investments were a little bit of Potemkin village, which is to say that, they made up a very nice village for the empress to ride past, and it turned out just to be cardboard cutouts. For instance, what we have are things like hypersonic missiles and fifth generation stealth fighters and guys that don't know to rotate tires on vehicles. right? So you've got a high-tech kit and a not very high-tech soldiery. The closest comparison I have to that is Saudi Arabia. They've got all kinds of fancy US kit, but their soldiers don't have the necessary professional discipline to use that kit as effectively as possible, which is why, for instance, you've got the Saudis with 21st century military kit who can't defeat the Houthis. So in that same sort of sense, Russia's military modernization didn't work as well as they planned. And that means they don't have the force multipliers. So they've run down the clock on this. And now they're facing a real serious demographic constraint, and their border is still out here in the middle of the plain. So for security purposes, as Russia is effectively twilighting itself demographically, it needs to find ways to be more secure. This is, you might say, the Russian-European space, and Russia needs to guard the doors. So that's, from their security perspective, what motivates this. Russia cannot stand the idea of having a giant border with Ukraine that could become NATO allied, where NATO tanks could eventually just, say, drive from Kharkiv to Moscow in the span of about 6 hours. Russia can't tolerate that. Russia needs as much depth as absolutely possible. And I'm not arguing that this is an acceptable way to do things. What I'm arguing is that this is, if I play the game as Russia, this is what I want to do. And this is why. So I've got an interesting problem where I need to move out and try to hold some of these pinch points as best as I can. But for now, my border is over here in Ukraine. So Ukraine is going to get devoured according to this sort of broad Russian plan. Now, what does Ukraine have to hold? Because it's nice to say strategically Russia needs Ukraine, but you got to pay for this somehow. And not to mention, these kinds of borders have been a problem for a while. So why now? Well, one of the reasons why now is demographics. The clock is ticking on Russia's ability to field a big army. Number two, the clock is beginning to tick on hydrocarbon. So Russia, as a major hydrocarbon power, has got 30 to 50 years of selling hydrocarbons left, just like our Middle Eastern powers, just like Alberta, just like the United States. If we don't get off of this stuff within the next half a century, we're kind of doomed. So in that sense, Russia is not going to have a better opportunity 5 years or 10 years from now to make this play. Its opponents would be stronger. Its opponents would be in a better position to resist it after another, say, half a decade or decade of investing in alternative energy sources. Right now, Russia is able to prevent a more, how do we say, aggressive intervention by the fact that many European nations still rely on Russia to keep the lights on. So that's the next reason why Russia invades. It's worth noting. And for this, I want to show you guys another fun picture. This one shows you where Ukraine's hydrocarbons are. One, you've got hydrocarbons all over and offshore gas and oil in Crimea. Crimea otherwise is strategically very useful as sort of an exclave that juts out into the Black Sea. It's got a very good naval port, but it also happens to be right beside a bunch of oil and gas that would be super useful. If Ukraine had been able to develop into a rationalized modern state without Russia invading it in 2014 and trying to hold the pillow down, Ukraine would be exporting more oil and gas to Europe. In fact, they have the second largest oil and gas reserves in Europe, which puts them in a position to get between Russia and their customers and sell Russian customers the same thing Russia was doing. Now, of course, Ukraine hasn't really developed these shale basins quite as well as it could, but that doesn't mean that they can't, because there are a few things you need to really develop a shale industry, and there are very few places in the world that have them. Ukraine happens to have them. The only thing it doesn't have is money. What you need is, of course, good geology to work with, a ton of petroleum engineers, an existing pipeline network, a bunch of fresh water, and a bunch of money. Ukraine has all of that except a bunch of money. So, given that setup, Ukraine is a very, very valuable prize for Russia, even if there were 0 humans and 0 cities for them to conquer. The space on the map is valuable. And that's really important to understand, right? Because when we start thinking about, why would you destroy a city, right? Like the original Russian plan, of course, was a quick sort of shock and awe American conquest of Iraq sort of thing, right? Try to collapse the enemy within 100 hours and see if they withstand it. When that obviously did not work very well, they had to fall back on a different kind of strategy of sort of terrorizing the locals to try to scare them into submission, that if you didn't submit to Russia, things were going to go really badly. But at the end of the day, like this, you can see why the Sun Tzu strategy wasn't followed. The Sun Tzu strategy basically says that you should try to take cities and territories whole, that destroying cities and killing people makes the conquest a lot less valuable. Like if we just in stark terms think about the net present value of an invasion, it is far better if everybody immediately submits happily to your authority and starts paying taxes on day one without a single bullet wasted. That's the best invasion possible. That's what they tried to do, and it didn't work. So there's got to be a reason for them to keep pushing. One, there's a lot of money on the table, a lot of hydrocarbons there, and that's an opportunity for them to prevent Ukraine from stealing their customers. Number two, there's a security reason for doing this because Russia's sitting out in the middle of an open field that is very vulnerable to other invaders. So between the juiciness of Ukraine and the need to control these borders, Russia finds itself in a security position of needing to hold Ukraine. Now, if I'm a reasonable human, the fact that Russia has some security needs does not enable Russia to take those security needs at the expense of other people. Just because Russia feels uncomfortable with its geography does not give it permission or any moral standing to go and destroy its neighbors to make itself feel safer. That would be like if the Americans decided that Canada was a threat to them, and in order to, well, secure their northern border, they needed to, well, ethnically cleanse Canada and drive us all into the sea. Right? Like it's not acceptable. Even if Russia finds itself in this position, right? Because there are two strategies for a nation that finds itself like this. There's hard power and there's soft power. And Russia is bad at soft power and has demonstrably failed at soft power for the last 7.5 years. Soft power is where you convince other people to join up with you, to be like you, because you're offering something that's better. The truth is that the soft power of the West basically seduced Ukraine, right? Ukraine was like, if I have a choice between Eurasian Economic Union sort of being ruled from Moscow or European Union and sort of being ruled from Brussels, I know which people have a better standard of living. So in that sense, the soft power struggle for that territory was easily won by the Europeans because Russia didn't have anything to offer, right? Russia didn't bother to cultivate a soft power notion. It is always focused on hard power and being able to dominate its borderlands. Like that has been Russian national strategies since before Catherine, right? Is just that's the way it's done. So unfortunately, they found themselves painted into this corner of having to make these very aggressive moves into Ukraine. So what was the response to this? Well, obviously, once Ukraine has been invaded, we understand why Russia's there and that they're not going to go home, right? Like that's the most important reason that I gave that exposition the last 10 minutes is so you understand why Russia's there. Russia's not going away from that. They're not leaving anytime soon. And Vladimir Putin has staked everything on this. If he fails at this, his own people will kill him, right? Like that's pretty stock and standard. When your authoritarian leader leads you into a military defeat, the generals just sort of stab that guy a couple of times and there's a coup, right? Like that's world history everywhere. So in that sense, Putin's painted himself into this corner and he must achieve at least some measure of victory. So in that sense, interestingly enough, May 9th is Victory Day over the Nazis, and the Russians will probably try to achieve some measure of victory by that point and say, look, we beat Nazis in Ukraine again, but the truth is that this isn't going to end on May 9th. This is definitely not going to end because what we've seen in the last 2 months is that the Ukrainians are just not willing to roll over. And that is made this whole thing enormously more difficult for Russia. Ukraine has been unwilling to be swallowed by the snake, effectively. They thought they were going to swallow a hedgehog, and they were like, this is juicy and it can't run fast. It turned out to be a porcupine covered in Stinger and Javelin missiles. And this has made it absolute nightmare for the Russians. But their problem is that they are now committed to a particular path. So Russia is elbow deep in this. They're not turning around. How do other countries respond to this? It's pretty clear what Ukraine does. Ukraine fights, right? And nobody really expected that. I guess they all sort of expected that, Zelensky would cave, and instead he was like, nope, I don't need a ride. I need more ammo. So that's pretty iconic. That phrase will probably live probably longer than the, fuck you Russian warship. But nonetheless, it raises an interesting sort of point because it required other countries to respond. If Ukraine had collapsed in 100 hours, other countries could have been like, oh my, and clutched their pearls. But the Ukrainians were like, yeah, we're not going out like that. So all of a sudden, there was a requirement for other countries to just step into this. And so now it's important for us to start playing as other countries and to start thinking about what kinds of responses they could reasonably take, right? So one of the easy responses, of course, you might say, and there was a lot of clamor for it in the first few weeks of the war, was that NATO should intervene, protect Ukraine, and close the skies, for instance. And it wasn't clear to people why that didn't ever happen, or why there aren't, large-scale military hardware transfers to Ukraine from countries like the United States. And for that, you've got to understand mutually assured destruction and nuclear game theory. Now, a lot of people are like, oh, he won't use the bombs. Okay, but let me just be really simple. Armchair generals have a lot of room to be wrong. Policymakers in charge of arsenals of hundreds or thousands of nuclear weapons do not have room to make mistakes. And so they don't have the room for moral outrage and declaring a war that becomes nuclear apocalypse simply because of moral outrage. You cannot do that if you are in charge of the nuclear arsenal. So there becomes a real friction point for people because policymakers cannot behave in purely moral ways. And what I mean by that is that a policymaker cannot be entirely motivated by moral outrage. For instance, just to give an example of moral outrage, should America start a nuclear war with China over Xinjiang? Anybody lining up to have your city obliterated and everyone you loved instantly killed? No? Okay, so let's back down from shaking nuclear weapons at other nuclear armed states. Does this limit our field of potential response? Absolutely. But this has always been the case. This has been the case since von Morgenstern in the 40s and 50s, and John Nash coming up with game theory specifically to help people develop strategies for nuclear war. And one of the important strategies that developed was what was called the mini-max solution. The mini-max solution was basically designed as a way to help decision makers or policymakers navigate their decision trees. And the purpose of the mini-max solution was to avoid taking any decisions that could possibly lead to nuclear apocalypse. And we're not talking about a couple of dozen nuclear weapons getting launched. We're talking thousands of warheads launched from both sides of the planet and all life on Earth ceasing to exist in about 24 hours worth of firestorm. So we don't want that. Nobody wants that. And we're not allowed to take any policy choices that put us on a path that could lead in that direction. Now, you might say, well, it won't go that direction as long as people are reasonable. I would encourage anybody who wonders about that to just watch a movie called Dr. Strangelove. It shows how quickly one person, an importantly placed person, can lead to a chain reaction of problems. Now, I'm not saying that there's going to be an uncontrolled nuclear war that results. That's not at all what I expect to have happen. You've got level heads on both sides of this conflict who are being very, very cautious about this. In fact, the Americans haven't noted that any change in the actual stance of Russian nuclear forces. They've raised their alert level, but they haven't done anything unusual. So in that sense, this is a bit of a boogeyman, but it is pointing out that if NATO countries really start stepping things up, and if there is Russian soldiers and NATO soldiers shooting at each other, now we're on the path that could go bad. Now, if we think back to the big picture of the North European plain and what the Russians need to do, what the Russians need to do will inevitably bring them into conflict with NATO nations because they've got to take half of Poland, a chunk of Romania, all the Baltic states. And so they're inevitably, if Russia were to get its way, is going to run into a variety of problems. And so, as a result, we see two important things in the response to this situation. One, countries are not taking any choices that could lead to nuclear war. So if they think in their policymakers' information set that a particular path could lead to nuclear war, they won't do it. And so all the armchair generals and people on social media clamoring for X, Y, Z, they're not being very realistic. Why is Zelensky asking for it? It's not that he's being unrealistic. It's that he has to. He has to. Every time a politician in a war appears on television, it's an intelligence operation. Think about it that way. He knows what his job is, and it's to shape opinion. So in that sense, we cannot have, or we are unlikely to see German troops rolling into Ukraine to fight Russian troops. A weird echo from 80 years ago, but we're unlikely to see that sort of thing. What we are more likely to see, though, is a notion that if Russia is not confronted, they will just roll over a whole bunch of that stuff. They will roll over the Baltics. They will eat up half of Poland. They'll eat a chunk of Romania. It's just going to happen that way. So NATO states have taken the approach of fortifying themselves significantly and basically saying, go ahead, Russia, drop a bomb on Poland. Watch what happens. Because the alignment of conventional forces is insanely in NATO's favor, just bluntly put. And that was even before we saw how bad the Russians were at fighting war. So in that sense, that you can see things like Germany doubling its defense budget in the next couple of years, right? So there's going to be very significant expenditures in the defense sector. Any defense contractors in Europe, anybody who makes bullets, anybody who makes rifles, missiles, jets, all of these companies are going to make excellent profits over the next few years. European defense industry is about to come alive at the sound of music because they've just been reminded that the Russians might invade them. They had been able to casually ignore that. And for the last 30 years, people were like, yes, the end of history. All of this is going to go just fine. And it obviously and quite clearly has not. So a whole new generation of people who are like, you cold warriors don't know what you're talking about, are suddenly scared as hell and trying to figure out what it is they need to do to be ready. So the Western strategy works like this. You want to harm Russia, hold them up as long as possible so that don't let Russia proceed to the point where a NATO-Russia conflict could happen. And that means hold them up in Ukraine as long as possible. So pardon the analogy, but what, for example, America and Britain have done is taken Ukraine like a sock puppet and punched Russia in the face 400 times. Like that's basically what has happened. The Americans and the Brits have pumped a ton of weaponry into the Ukrainians, tons of information into the Ukrainians, and they have not only been training them for the last 8 years, but they provided them with all kinds of things like satellites, and they provided them with all kinds of things like hunter-killer drones. Those Turkish drones have done a number on Russian armor. They've done all kinds of significant support for the Ukrainians without putting their own soldiers on the ground. As of yesterday, Ukraine's defense ministry estimated there was something like 20,000 foreigners fighting in their country on Ukraine's side. So what we do see is a little bit like in the Spanish Civil War, where Canadians went over and fought, but they weren't officially Canadian soldiers. We see the same sort of thing happening, where Western countries are basically propping up Ukraine as much as possible. They're pumping money, they're pumping aid, they're pumping weapons, they're even unofficially pumping soldiers and things like jet parts into Ukraine. Why? Because they want to make Ukraine undigestible for Russia. They want to make it so that the snake has swallowed a porcupine and not a hedgehog. And the end result, I hate to say, is that Ukraine is going to be ground into dust in the meantime. And that's devastating, quite frankly. I like that. It's heartbreaking to see. But what ends up happening is this is the hill where the West and Russia have decided to fight. And this is going to be devastating for the people of Ukraine. Now, when we take a look at one particular aspect of the Western response, has been the use of economic means of harming the Russians. They haven't bombed the Russians, you know, there was no Donald Trump solution of paint our jets to look like Chinese jets that nobody will know better, right? Like, you gotta be super dumb to think that's actually gonna work on anybody. But nonetheless, it's important for us to understand what the shape of the response to Russia has been, because we're likely to continue seeing that for some time. Now, just a quick question. Mark put up in the chat, he said, is the America, UK not worried about supplying weapons, anti-tank aircrafts? Is it going to push Russia to use weapons of mass destruction, or at the very least bioweapons? I don't know that Russia would be compelled to. There are a couple of things. When we take a look at like most weapons of mass destruction, they're not very useful for battlefield purposes. Like, admittedly, tactical nuclear weapons are fantastic for area denial and for wiping out large amounts of military hardware. Biological weapons have a lot of problems. One, you have to deliver them, right? Like, you need to aerosol a bioweapon. You can't attach it to something that explodes, because if it's got spores, the explosion kills all the spores. So bioweapons notoriously hard to use. Plus, there's the problem of if it gets out, Right? Like you don't have to have read The Stand to understand the problem of if a bioweapon gets out and starts infecting your own people. If you can't, inoculate your own troops against it, a bioweapon is indiscriminate in who it kills. And chemical weapons are not nearly as effective as people thought they were 100 years ago. They're very good for scaring people, but a good strong gust of wind makes your chemical weapons all but useless. If you were going to say gas the Azov-style steel plant, yeah, you could do that where you've got people in a constrained area. Or if you were going to engage in urban warfare, then maybe doing some kind of gas-based attack might drive people out of their cover. But I don't think that we're going to see on any kind of massive scale weapons of mass destruction being deployed. I don't see it as being likely personally. It's too risky for the Russians at the end of the day. Now, in my opinion, the Western response has not only been to supply military goods to Ukraine, but also to wage what has been called economic war on Russia, which is an interesting sort of term. I read a book a few years ago on geoeconomics and statecraft that the Council on Foreign Relations put out called War by Other Means. And at the time, it was very critical about how badly organized America was for economic competition against China. I think some policymakers must have read the book because they have clearly gotten their acts together right in time for Russian-Ukrainian war. And they have made some significant shots against the Russians in terms of their economy. So ultimately, the goal of sort of waging economic war is that it solves the minimax problem. Economic war is highly unlikely to lead to the use of nuclear weapons. No country's military doctrine includes, they crashed our stock market, so we nuke their capital. Like no country's military doctrine includes that. So it's generally seen as being that economic war is a little bit like conventional war. As long as you don't, escalate this to nuclear weaponry and city destruction, we are not escalating it to city destruction. So economic war is seen as being okay, but not quite enough that Russian jets are going to start flying sorties against, French jets. So it's seen as being an escalation, but not close enough that Russia can feel confident attacking NATO countries. So basically what they've done is, to ape a modern term, they've canceled Russia. They voted with their dollars and they're like, okay, Russia, that's cool. I know you have lots of stuff that we want, but there's a bunch of stuff that we have that you need, as it turns out. And we're just going to deny it to you. So since industrial total war got started in the 20th century, a big aspect of warfare has been destroying people's ability to continue fighting. Right? That's why you bomb things like railroad tracks. That's why you attack oil refineries, factories, things like that. You prevent them. It's that way. Even if you had 1 million guys who wanted to fist fight, it just wouldn't matter because they don't have any bullets. They don't have any vehicles to drive them to the front so they can fist fight whoever. Right? Like you need to have an economy under you. Otherwise, you're basically Bronze Age club people. Like you need to do a little bit better. So the notion of economic war has been to degrade Russia's ability to wage conventional war in Ukraine. Now, that's part of it. Now, people have noted that economic warfare, supply destruction, takes a long time. Because unless we're going to fly over Russia and start bombing shit, we basically need to degrade the usage of it. Now, there are only a few assets that really have particularly problematic profiles in this regard, because there's a lot of assets that you could just shut down for a little while. Let's say, I don't know, let's say we had a plant that makes SUVs. And all of a sudden, because of, say, a variety of complex sanctions, we can't sell SUVs. You can just sort of mothball that thing and come back a year later and turn your factory on. There's a little bit of time, but it's not, we're talking about a couple of months to get your factory back up and running. The big one that they're playing around with is oil shut in. Oil is not an asset you can just turn off and turn back on. So for this, talk a little bit about oil. We have basically two kits for dealing with oil, a 20th century and a 21st century. And the 21st century kit is largely fracking. In a fracked well, you can frack it and close it right up and turn it back on in about 6 weeks of lead time. With a conventional oil well, there is a serious problem. A conventional oil well, runs on the premise that there's a bunch of oil under a salt cap, and you crack through the salt cap and oil comes gushing out of it. And it just keeps coming until it's out of oil, right? That's Gawar in Saudi Arabia, 70 years of just oil shooting out of the sand. The problem is when you want to stop that oil from coming through the sand, right? How do you cap it? What you normally need to do is pump a bunch of concrete into the porous rock so that it settles. And that means that the oil gets locked back into its geological formation. Sounds good until you realize how hard it's going to be to reactivate that well. You're going to re-drill that well through concrete. Keep in mind, most Russian oil production is also on permafrost, which means that you can only actually start drilling those wells in the dead dark of winter when the ground is frozen enough. If Russian oil starts getting shut in, they may very well be forced to downgrade their oil production capacity significantly. And that's not something that's going to grow back anytime soon. The last time Russians shut in a bunch of their oil was immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They fell from about 10 to 6 million barrels of oil per day. Almost half their capacity was shut in. They didn't get back up to 10 million barrels of oil a day for 28 years. So when you shut in oil, it's a generation to get it back, because it's not just a matter of, oh, just drill through that concrete cap. You then have to check every seal on thousands of miles of pipeline. You need to make sure that your refineries have been kept up and running the whole time, even though a bunch of your oil has been shut in. So the objective of sort of economic warfare is to cause supply destruction in Russia. The biggest aspect of that is going to be oil shut in. Because honestly, things like factories, you can turn that off. You can walk away from that. But oil shut in, that has the potential to cause a generation of damage to Russia. Now, there's been some speculation about this, but I read a report that's 12 days old from the IEA, the International Energy Association, the IEA. And they estimated that a month ago, that they would see significant Russian oil shut-in happening by this month. And we've started to see some of it. What they're really anticipating, though, is a significant increase in that Russian production is going to fall even more over the next 4 weeks. So here's where things start getting bad for Russia, because if this had gone fast and clean, Russia wouldn't necessarily have to shut things down, but this has not gone fast and clean. And therefore, they are now bogged down, and there's an opportunity to inflict a lot of long-term pain on Russia. In order to do that, though, Western states are going to have to keep up their economic siege. So only part of this economic siege has involved oil and gas, right? And other significant aspects of it have involved seizing assets. For example, freezing half of Russia's reserves. They were like, yes, we built up a few $100 billion worth of dollars. If the war breaks out, at least we'll have lots of dollars. Oh, wait, those are in American banks. That was dumb. Oh, we have a bunch of money in euros, and that was dumb. We have a bunch of monies in pounds, and that was dumb. The only thing that they're left holding on to really are rubles, yuan, like RMBs, and commodities. Because the Russians generally try to stockpile things like diamonds, gold, and other things in their central bank as well. But they have some significant problems. They've run into asset seizures. They've run into boycotts on their oil and gas, which has made it very challenging for them to find a place for all that oil and gas to go. Now, some people have said, oh, China and India will buy it all. There are some logistical problems with China and India buying it all. First off, you have to be able to sail a tanker either to St. Petersburg, or you've got to be able to bring a tanker into the Black Sea, or you have to deal with the pipeline capacity that brings it out to the Pacific. To suddenly say Russia can take all of its oil that it used to send to the West and just start sending it east, it can't. It just can't. In terms of tanker capacity, you might say, well, can't we get a bunch of little tankers in there and just extract that oil and then transfer it to another boat at sea? One, that's super risky. Two, you still have to have ships that are willing to do that. And here's where those financial sanctions have really been starting to bite. Insurance companies won't insure those ships. So captains won't take their ships in. So they're having trouble getting ships to take on Russian crude, let alone having problems unloading it at certain ports. So what's starting to happen is the Europeans are basically boycotting Russia. the West is basically boycotting Russia. And so Russia is trying to find other customers. Right now, Russian oil is selling at a $38 discount to Brent light crude. If you take a look at what's called the Urals Brent spread, it's almost $40. It's never been that high. So the Russians are selling their oil at an extraordinary discount just to try to get it out to somebody so that they don't have to shut it in. Now, in addition to all that, Russian companies have been cut off from the SWIFT network, which makes it really hard for them to get paid on any of their international business. A lot of Russia's earnings for the government come from state-owned enterprises that are involved in exporting commodities. A lot of those commodities are priced in dollars. If they can't transact in dollars, then it becomes really challenging for them to find customers for all of their commodity exports. And so we've been seeing substantial roiling in a lot of commodity markets as a result of this sort of economic warfare that the West has been waging on Russia. And now that we understand what Russia is doing, what the Western response has been, we can start looking at the economic impact of this economic war. What does this mean for us? How can we make sense of this? Now, Jillian asked, what role is Turkey playing in the war? Are they playing both sides? No. Turkey needs Russian oil and gas. They're deeply dependent on it. Turkey basically needs Russian food. So if Turks want to eat and have lights on, they trade with Russia. By the same token, they've stopped the Russians from moving any of their military hardware that was out in the Mediterranean back into the Black Sea. So Turkey is effectively playing its good NATO role. Remember that historically, Turkey and Russia don't get along. Hundreds of years of competition between the Ottomans and the Russians does not go away. Their competition is based on trying to dominate the Black Sea. Two big powers want to dominate the Black Sea, and it's going to be one or the other. Even though they occasionally get along and find things here or there that they might agree on, they are fundamentally in competition with one another. So Turkey's not really playing both sides so much as trying to keep the lights on and keep the food while still supplying Ukraine with things like military hardware, and particularly those Bayraktar drones that have been trashing Russian tanks for the last couple of months. So let's talk a little bit about the economic impact of this. First off, there has been crazy inflation in Russia. No surprise, the value of the ruble all but collapsed, right? Like it got cut in half and it's bounced back, and people are like, oh yes, the sanctions aren't working. Look, the ruble's doing fine. Putin gave an interview to Al Jazeera 2 days ago where he tried to trot that out. And he failed to mention the capital controls, the fact that nobody's allowed to sell rubles, right? So what we have is a government that is propping this up as hard as they can. And they're like, look, it works just fine, Potemkin village. So that's a big problem. They're also running into significant challenges in Russia because of certain things they used to import that they just can't. In particular, certain high-tech kit. Because remember, if you want to run high-tech 21st century weaponry, you basically need computer chips. Russia doesn't manufacture a lot of computer chips. In fact, it's gotten so bad, the lack of computer chips, that Russian automobile makers have cut down their production by half in the last month, which has cascaded into fewer orders for Russian steel, which is creating all kinds of upstream problems for commodity producers within Russia, because they're starting to feel the real impact of not being able to make certain kind of products that require microchips. One of the interesting ones, their precision-guided munitions run on chips that aren't even made in Russia. So they've been asking the Chinese to send more chips. China is waffling, because at the end of the day, if Russia gets a little weaker and more dependent on China, China's cool with that. Geopolitics, right? But beyond that, what has been the impact outside of Russia? What has been the economic impact or fallout on us? Well, first off, there's been disruption to all kinds of commodity markets, right? As I'm sure everybody has read in the news, there are a few key commodity markets where you might say the Slavic bloc of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus are absolutely essential to. And these markets have been significantly disrupted. Just to quote 4 easy commodities or commodity groups. First, you have grains, right? Between Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, you have significant disruption to planting, let alone the ability to export that food. Now, it's not terrible because Russia is having a bumper crop right now. So it's not that there is no food available, but let's just say that it's been very challenging for Ukrainian exporters to get their food brought to market. And there are real concerns about not food right now, but the food cycle 6 and 12 months from now. Because people often forget that economic impacts do not happen fast like a train wreck. They happen at a much slower pace, right? So when things go wrong now in, say, our ability to generate potash or our ability to get natural gas to fertilizer developments, that's going to lead to famine down the road. So right now, the fact that we're having disruptions in things like markets for phosphate and nitrogen-based fertilizers is going to mean that a lot of countries are not going to get the yields they anticipate on their crops this year. Now, you might not be aware, but we were already facing global food problems. Over the prior year leading up to this, food inflation has been very significant. We don't feel it at the Sobeys because if things go up 3 pennies, we probably don't notice. But there are a lot of countries around the world that are, how do we say, a lot more on edge when it comes to food supply compared to Canada. And they definitely feel it. For instance, if you take a look at the last time we had significant rise in grain prices, which would have been 2008, 2009, within 2-3 years, that led to the Arab Spring, as we saw massive political disruptions all across North Africa and the Middle East that were largely driven not by desires for democracy, but by people being so fed up with their elite's inability to put bread on the table. Because at the end of the day, if you want to be a dictator, people will put up with your shit as long as they have food. But as soon as there's no food, they will face down your guys with machine guns. And that's just the truth of it, right? People who are going to starve to death anyways are happy to walk out and face a guy with a gun. So there are some real significant concerns about how food is going to end up being distributed. So there's direct impact of grains not reaching market. This is going to be very good for India, by the way, who's also having a decent crop this year and is happy to sell it. So the Russians and the Indians will largely be able to help make up for the lack of Ukrainian crops. But the big problem is going to be fertilizer. We don't realize how important fertilizer is, but if you get rid of modern fertilizers, the ability to make food on this planet drops by about 2/3, which means billions of humans die. So we are deeply leveraged. In the same way we're kind of leveraged on electricity, we're really leveraged on fertilizer. We require this. It's one of those invisible things that makes the planet as we know it possible with 8 billion humans. Without fertilizer, that doesn't happen. So there's been a serious disruption to fertilizer production because Ukraine, Belarus, Russia produce a lot of nitrogen, phosphate, and potash-based fertilizers. So fertilizer prices are up all over the world. And a lot of farmers right now who are otherwise planting their crops are having a hard time deciding what to plant based on the availability of fertilizers. Now, in some regions of the world, this is going to be problematic, right? Like, as I pointed out, Middle East and North Africa is going to run into significant problems in terms of politics, right? Like, this is what happened with the Arab Spring a decade and a half ago. Where things are likely to get worse is in the Sahel region in Africa. So just below the Sahara, but still in that band from West Africa, running into about Ethiopia. The big problem is that you've had population explosion there for the last 50, 60 years that has been predicated entirely on access to cheap energy and fertilizers and food, right? Like when we take a look at a country like Nigeria or a country like Ghana or a country like Mali, these populations are growing very rapidly. They cannot necessarily feed themselves. If there is a shortage of food arriving, if there is a shortage of fertilizers arriving, we're not just dealing with higher prices and political instability. We're dealing with famine. The kind of thing that we thought went away in at the end of the 20th century when everybody was getting rich. We face famine in certain regions. And this is a real serious economic problem. Maybe not for us comfortably in Canada, but we should be aware of the implications of this, that 6 months from now, 12 months from now, there are going to be serious political disruptions from this, and there are going to be serious economic consequences. Because once we've knocked over one domino, there's a whole chain reaction of things that are going to take place over the next 6 months, the next 12 months. And the longer this goes on, the more we have to prepare for the fact that things are not going to work like they did in 2019, let alone 2021, right? To put it bluntly, Vlad has changed the game, and Putin has just simply changed the alignment of forces unilaterally. It's not going back to the way it was. And so that leaves us in an interesting kind of position. Because if we think that this is going to go on for a while, then that we expect that economic siege to go on for a while, and we expect that ultimately Russia is going to have to find new customers. And that means shifting trading patterns. Shifting trading patterns is not something that can't be done. It just takes time and it costs money. So there's going to be significant costs. And when you think about this from the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model perspective, what happens when costs rise? Supply goes down. When supply is constrained in that type of model, less quantity reaches markets and higher prices, what we otherwise experience as inflation. So in all of these disrupted markets, we are expecting to see sustained inflation, at least over the next year. Now, on top of that, we have a complicating problem, which was that to get through COVID, governments around the world expanded money supplies substantially to the point where we were having inflationary problems before this got started. We were already worried about how fast we were going to have to raise interest rates this year. Now, on top of having excess demand in the form of too much money, we have a shortage of supply because we're engaged in an economic war. And there's supply destruction happening, long-term aggregate supply, as we destroy cities, kill thousands of people, and annihilate industries. So there is a long-term supply destruction that's going to take a generation or two to grow back. There's just going to be less aggregate supply available. And that means, of course, higher prices across the board. So when we look at that, higher prices across the board generally means for the Europeans, when they're faced with shortages of energy, revanchist Russia on their doorstep, an expansion of their defense bills, and higher energy prices, there's a recession coming in Europe. This is going to be particularly problematic for them, especially since the European Central Bank doesn't exactly have a lot of dry ammunition. So they're going to have to decide very carefully exactly how strongly they want to enforce budget rules that they've been putting on to various nations, like how much of a deficit you're allowed to run, given that they may very well be facing an existential war for their own survival. I can sort of see the Europeans parking that, but that's going to ultimately lead to blowing out government budgets. And there will be a period of reckoning where the governments just simply will not be able to support both all the social spending they've been engaged in and their new defense budgets. So something's going to have to give. And I suspect that we're going to see a recession coming in Europe. In terms of India and China are making out like bandits right now. They're buying everything that Russia has to sell super cheap, basically as much as Russia can sell. The problem is that there are simply bottlenecks. One, India can't buy everything Russia sells. This is right out the gate. There's not enough capacity for India to buy everything Russia sells. So good for India, good for Russia. It's not enough to keep Russia alive. Russia would need China to buy everything Russia makes. The problem is that Russia's entire economy is located in the West and 90% of it aims west. So it's a bit of a fantasy. Yeah, I realize Russia's right beside China, but all of Russia's industry is in the West. Most of those pipelines point west. Most of the money that finances investment in Russia comes from the West. It's not that China doesn't have a role to play. It's not that China isn't going to make money off of this. It's not that China's strategic position isn't advanced by this. It's that China can't do enough for Russia. And they're not going to do enough for Russia. Because if I'm China, you have to remember a piece of Chinese history. They almost got into a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Like in living memory, they fought a war with thousands of soldiers shooting at each other for a couple of weeks in the Ussuri River in 1968. So we've got to remember the Russians and the Chinese, like it was at a point where the Russians and the Chinese were threatening each other with nuclear weapons in the 20th century. The only reason Nixon goes to China is because there was a wicked break between Mao and the Russians. So the Russians and the Chinese get along right now out of convenience. Out of convenience because there's America and they're both faced off against America. But let me tell you, Russia and China are about as friendly as Turkey and Russia are. In the long run, they have conflicting interests. And even if in the short run, they might be on the same page, they don't trust each other. So Russia is not keen to get into bed with China in a way it can't get out. And China is very happy to let Russia fall into a position of dependency. So what does that leave us with? North America. It just so turns out that all of the stuff that is we're seeing all the commodity markets we're seeing disrupted as a result of this war. Grains and fertilizers, energy, and importantly, metals, platinum group metals, are all being disrupted. It turns out North America produces all that stuff. And we not only produce that stuff, we produce so much of it that we export that stuff. So it turns out that a little bit like World War II, we're sitting pretty. Europe is going to have a war on its doorstep, and North America is going to have factories that don't get bombed and produce massive amounts of natural resources in order to fuel any kind of war effort that might emerge. A North American resource fund would probably be the easiest play to make. In fact, North American resource funds up 25% since the war started. And that's just looking at a broad thesis of what it is that is going to happen, right? Like we're going to see continued disruption to these commodity markets. So anybody who produces those commodities and can get them to market is going to make money. Anybody that is building weaponry to replace all of those Javelin and Stinger missiles and all of those bullets is going to make money. So defense contractors and commodity makers. To try to understand a little bit more of the further economic fallout, it's worthwhile to consider the context in which all this is happening. As I mentioned, we already had problems with inflation and food prices and energy prices before Russia invaded Ukraine. Don't lose sight of that. We already had a problem on our hands when this broke out. So the response to this, of course, is going to ultimately involve trying to get inflation back in the bag. Now, we've only seen a couple of periods in Canadian history, modern Canadian history, the last 50, 60 years, where we've seen commodity-based recessions. One of these occurs at the end of the 1970s, right? We see the 1970s, the economy sort of goes flat for a while, productivity has problems, we're seeing rising energy costs, and economic growth sort of stagnates. Once inflation starts kicking in, the solution for that was for central banks to raise interest rates until real interest rates, the nominal rate minus inflation, was large enough that people stopped borrowing to consume and invest. In other words, the medicine for inflation is recession. The Bank of Canada, in my estimate, is that they're going to induce a recession on purpose. It makes a lot of sense as far as I'm concerned. If I am the Bank of Canada, I need to find a way to slow down inflation. As you may have seen in today's news, we had hit 6.7%. So 6.7% inflation with a 1% risk-free rate. Put your money in the bank, watch it shrivel at 5-6% a year. Not a chance. People will revolt against that. That's what we would otherwise refer to as financial repression. This will lead to all kinds of weird behaviors unless central banks start raising interest rates. We've already seen the Fed raising interest rates, and they will continue to do so aggressively all year long. People are talking about, oh, interest rates might hit 3%. They're not done. If you're worried about interest rates hitting 3%, I very casually encourage you to think about a world where interest rates are going to need to hit 5 and 6%, 7 or 8%. And if that terrifies you in terms of paying your mortgage, there's a lot of people who are in that position. They bought all the house they can, even with the stress test that requires you to be able to afford the mortgage payments when it's 2-3% interest rate higher. We're going to blow right through that stress test. 6.5% inflation gets fought with 8% short-term risk-free rates. Even if they had to raise the short-term rate to 5%, that's an 8% mortgage rate. So what's going to happen to these people whose mortgages start to readjust to higher interest rates over the next couple of years? Well, to put it simply, they're going to have to cut back on their consumption. And that's how everybody does it. They cut back on discretionary consumption rather than defaulting on their mortgage. And that means recession time as well. Now, the last time the Bank of Canada induced a recession to fight inflation in Canada was 1990 to 1992. In that period, we saw interest rates rise substantially. Mortgage rates rose to the point of 9, 10, 11%, and housing prices across the entire GTA fell by roughly 30% between 1990 and 1993. So if you want to know why Toronto Housing Board graphics always start their data set around 1993, now you know why. That's the bottom of the last crash. So they cherry pick the data to make it look like, oh yes, housing prices rise, and they only rise. But if you take a look at the data set going back to including the 1980s, you'll see that there's a very significant decline in housing prices in Toronto. And that's an important thing for people to keep in mind. Housing prices can come down. They do come down. And so I really want to encourage you to be cautious about that. Interest rates are going up. The Bank of Canada, in order to fight inflation, will induce a recession. If you think they wouldn't hurt people, but people need that. Yeah, you know who's been getting hurt the last 20 years, last 15 years of ultra low interest rates that mortgage borrowers have benefited from? Every pensioner, everyone on a fixed income has suffered as their interest rates are less than inflation. So the pendulum is going to swing back in favor of positive real interest rates. And that means that people who have borrowed very heavily need to start thinking carefully about deleveraging. And that means they're going to spend less money on consuming things. They're going to spend less money on vacations, less money on electronics, and they're going to spend more money deleveraging and trying to pay for all the house they just bought. So that's sort of where I see things going for the next little bit. The war in Russia and Ukraine obviously is going to continue to disrupt commodity markets. Canada will do well from disrupted commodity markets, I hate to say. Where our problem is going to lie is inflation. The Bank of Canada is already taking significant steps to unwind the quantitative easing that we did conduct over the last couple of years. That should be unwound within a year or two. And they're raising interest rates. We should expect interest rates to keep going up. And I think that's the biggest, most important takeaway from this. There are going to be certain commodity markets which will benefit from this. There are going to be second and third order effects that are going to create political complications around the world. So certain kinds of regions are simply going to be a lot more dangerous to invest in. And there will be certain opportunities for countries like India and China to profit from Russia's crappy position right now. That said, I hope the Ukrainians win. Otherwise, I'm happy to field any questions you guys have. I wanted to try to wrap this up in about an hour of chit chat, so that's what I got to. So I'm going to take a look now through the chat really quick, just to see if there's any questions in there I can field. And otherwise, we'll just open this up, open the floor. There's a couple of videos in there that John and Jamie posted. I haven't had a chance to look through those obviously yet, but thank you for that. I plan to look at them as soon as we're done. Shubham asks, should the World Trade Organization become lenient with its policies, considering food crisis might get worse in the coming years? It depends which WTO policies you mean. Most of the time, WTO policies are about resolving disputes between countries to prevent things like dumping. So if a country's producing excess amounts of steel or whatnot, I think what we're likely to see in terms of food supplies, it's going to be really tricky, because we're going to run into limits of how much food is there. Grain stocks, this is one of the things that you can look at, are just like countries maintain energy stocks, and you can look up what the energy stocks of various countries are. They also maintain grain stocks. A lot of commodity stocks you can look up, as a matter of fact. And one of the things that's been interesting to note is that for the last couple of years, China has been hoarding a lot of commodities, a lot of metals, and a lot of grain. As much as half of the world's stored grain is in China right now. So they're sitting on a whole pile of commodities. I suspect in anticipation that they could have a conflict with America. And so they are sort of stockpiling ahead of time. But the big implication is that means that we don't have a lot of full warehouses around the world. And that means that anything that disrupts prices causes enormous price gyrations, like we saw in the nickel market a few weeks ago. So I think we're going to see an enormous amount of volatility in food markets. I would tend to think that the big grain traders like Archer Midland Daniels, I think that's the name of it. Yeah, Archer Midland, are likely to see good profits from a lot of heavy trading in that space. But I think we're very seriously going to run into fertilizer problems. And by 2023, we're going to have real food problems in certain areas. I'm not sure what we can do to alleviate that. I think this is a physical supply limit. I don't know. I wish I had a good answer of what to do about famine, but I just don't know. Tom asked, how long do you think what Russia has prepared for this war effort to last before they have to make a choice? I think Russia is well prepared for this. I think they've known for a long time they had to do this. I think they could see the demography 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I think they could look at the map, and the map hasn't changed in centuries. And so from Russia's point of view, it was simply a matter of when will we have the ability to undo what happened in 1991? They see it as existential. They see it as absolutely essential. If Russia doesn't win here, Russia is going to collapse probably into about 10 or 12 different countries in the next 20, 30 years. They may be able to hold it together, but it could very quickly turn into a Chinese warring states type of situation, or like, like warlords in the early 20th century. I hope that doesn't happen, because that sort of thing is always terrible for civilians everywhere. And as a civilian, I don't want any civilians to suffer. But I think that Russia is deeply committed to this. I think they can go for a little while. They have resourcing to go for a little while. Their people are used to being able to suffer a little bit. The autocratic propaganda machine is on high. People are being told this is an existential fight against Nazis for the survival of Russia. So of course they put up with that stuff. They remember hearing those same stories about how their grandparents, resisted the Nazis, and they're doing their part now. So there's a lot of weird things if you watch Russian media right now. It's the narrative's a little jarring, frankly. But I think they're prepared to go for a while. The big limit is going to be military hardware. There was an interesting discussion that came up, I saw, related to who will run out first. Will the Russians run out of tanks and armor before the Americans run out of javelins? And that's a very valid question, because it's not like Russia can't make more tanks and more armor, but how fast can they make tanks and armor? And remember, every time one of those tanks or armored vehicles is destroyed, the entire crew inside dies in a horrible conflagration. So do you have crews that know how to use those vehicles? Or do you have conscripts taken from, far-flung regions in Siberia? Because if you start losing your good soldiers too quickly and you start losing your hardware, I don't care how many guys you shove into it, you're not going to win. The big thing that I think would stop Russia in its tracks would be a 1917 style revolution. The military decides that they're tired of losing bodies to this. But the reason I think that is unlikely to occur, at least in the near term, is because the motivation for Russia to invade Ukraine is military. They see it as militarily required of them to do this. And so they're not looking at this from a point of view of what is the cost, what is the NPV of this. They look at it from a security point of view and saying, if we don't do this, we'll be invaded. If not next generation, the generation after that. So the Russians have prepared well for this. I would say it's hard for me to gauge how long specifically, but I would say they could keep doing this for at least another 3 to 6 months. I think Russia would have a very hard time keeping this up for much longer than about maybe another 2-3 months longer than what they've done now, because at the rate they're losing troops, it's enormous. It's been estimated that they've lost 20,000 deaths and another 20,000 wounded. You can't keep losing troops at that rate and stay militarily active. So I think that Russia is going to have to hit a breaking point probably by the end of June. End of June, July, sometime at the latest. If something hasn't happened, it will. That would be my estimate. But I'm not a military, so take that with Lot's wife. All right, let me see what else. Ankit asks, any commodities we should stockpile to ride through the oncoming inflation? In general, you could own shares of companies that produce commodities. That's a pretty easy one. Like I said, just own a mutual fund that's like a North American resource fund with a low MER. Real easy, ride that out. In particular, let me think, any specific commodities? I don't like to offer specific recommendations for individual commodities. I would point out that industries that rely on those commodities are going to face rising costs, though. So, for example, electric vehicles are going to see their margins constrained over the next little bit. So I'd watch out for those. Companies that rely heavily on these commodities that I listed off are going to run into some challenges. What to invest in to beat an inflationary economy? Real assets and things that generate yield. When interest rates are super low and there's no inflation, you can speculate all day and be like, woo, Dogecoin is going to the moon. When there's real inflation, people don't screw around with that. They buy stuff that generates yield. They buy stuff that has pricing power. So what you want to do is focus on industries where you have, differentiation. You want to focus on companies that have strong brand names and the ability to raise prices. In Canada, you want to focus on oligopolies that we have no choice but to do business with. Rogers is going to make money no matter what, because we all like internet. Bell is going to make money no matter what. They've got us over a barrel. So in those sense, the powerful oligopolies will be able to pass on price increases, especially for non-discretionary goods. Right, so don't buy things like electronics makers and stuff like that. They're going to get crushed when the recession comes around. But things that make electricity, or or food distribution, those things are going to be essential, and I think those would do pretty well in there as too. Another question we got: as Russia and China is accumulating gold with high inflation in the U.S., do you think we could see the world going back to gold currency rather than dollars? No, gold is a trash currency. There's too many humans. There's too many people. Too many people and not enough gold. Even when we did have the gold standard in the 19th century, we were always bouncing off supply limits. There were regular problems with it in Great Britain and in the United States. Every 20 years or so, there was a financial crisis, not because there's some magical waves, but because what would happen is that we weren't able to get enough gold fast enough to keep up with the economic expansion. And the way that we cut the corner was to offer more credit on the same amount of gold. And that's what causes your weird contractionary problems throughout history. So gold wasn't enough. This is why there was a bimetallism movement to try to have both silver and gold to get around the supply problems of gold. I don't think we're going back to gold anytime soon. That said, I think that people will probably buy gold because the traditional hedge against inflation, it's the inherited wisdom from our grandparents that the way to avoid inflationary problems is to own gold. Most people get that from the 1970s. The fact that gold prices rose dramatically once they were unhinged from the US dollar, and we saw a huge increase in the price of oil. That said, we also saw a big increase in the price of gold then. I'm not sure that we're going to see the same thing. We have alternatives to it. The main reason that gold was historically used was because it was, well, high value to lightweight. That's really what it comes down to. And there's not a lot of other things that we that can necessarily replicate that in the Bronze Age. But in the modern age, I can have $1 billion on a USB drive. So gold is not as essential at the end of the day. That said, I own a little bit of gold for speculative purposes, but I own a little bit. Before we all sign off, could I ask as many of you as are comfortable turn on your cameras for a class pic? Hey, yeah, that's a nice idea. Nice to see you guys. All 5 of you. Look at all the extra humans. So any other questions I can answer for you guys about this? I realize that, like I said, a lot of this stuff came out in the news over the last month, and I'm sure you've read a lot of this stuff about commodity disruptions. But hopefully, at least I was able to give you a little bit more backgrounding to this and give you a little bit more to work with in terms of building your own models for understanding what could result. I think that's particularly important. It's better for me to tell you why I think what I do, as opposed to me just, being a mystic at the front of the room who like provides wisdom, because that's garbage, right? At the end of the day, I want you guys who are like, you're here to get an MBA, you're here to get an education. You should be able to leave this program and think a little bit like this and be like, okay, so what are the chain reactions that result from these sorts of things? What other kinds of forces impact the business environment? So that's why I wanted to kind of, show you guys what's under the hood and give you some idea about why I think what I do, because I think it'll help you to improve your own analytics. Yes, Shiva.
Thanks, Professor, for this wonderful session and answering all my questions. Just to follow up on the last question related to gold. So I think one of the main reasons people moved from gold to dollar was the trust in dollar. And now when the inflation in US is so high as compared to the last decades, do you think people will lose trust in dollars, like considering the policy and the enormous printing of dollar, and then we might move to some alternate base currency, not maybe gold maybe we move to crypto or something. I don't know. But do you think people are losing trust in dollar?
I think people have been losing the trust in the dollar for 60 years. The reason it isn't going to fall apart is because, in my opinion, the value of the currency is ultimately supported by the capacity, the geography of the country, right? A country's capacity to generate wealth. So that's one thing to consider. And America has wicked good geography. Number two, your capacity to defend your geography. And they've got thousands of miles of water in the two directions that largely matter to them. They've got a navy that could defeat every other navy on Earth put together in the span of like 24 hours. So in that sense, what are we buying when we use American dollars? Or why are we using it? We're ultimately using it because there's a very powerful network effect associated with it. But the basis of that network effect is that people wanted to deal with America. And part of dealing with America was not just buying and selling stuff to America, trading with America. Let me describe a weird situation that happened in the 70s between the Saudis and the Americans, what we would today call the petrodollar nexus. After the Americans sort of decoupled the dollar from gold, one of the things they did in order to keep up or to maintain international support for the dollar and to maintain the euro dollar market, which was people outside of America using it to transact amongst themselves, was that the Saudis agreed that they would price all of their oil in dollars. This meant that anybody that wanted to buy Saudi oil had to buy dollars in order to do it. Now, why would the Saudis do that? Because the Americans promised to beat up anybody that tried to mess with the Saudis. Simple as that. So the Saudis were basically willing to say, we're going to sell our oil and generate demand for the currency that protects us. So until somebody's going to protect the UAE and Saudi in the same way that the Americans have, nope, we're using dollars. And like MBS talks a big show about, I don't care what Joe Biden thinks of me. Yeah, he does. Yeah, he does. His grandpa sure does. So he might talk really tough, but the end of the day, the Saudis can't defend their own country. If the Iranians want to take it from them, they will. So the Saudis are kind of over a barrel. They talk tough. It's a bit like the UAE. They like to style themselves as Little Sparta, but Little Sparta would get overrun by the Persians. So at the end of the day, it's American security that keeps the Persian Gulf states pricing oil in dollars, and that helps to maintain the euro dollar market. It's not the only thing that maintains the euro dollar market, but it certainly helps.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sweet. So I hope this is really useful for everybody. I'm going to grab that picture, Penny. All right, everybody. We got BL652 coming this fall. So we're going to be talking corporate finance. We got like 7 weeks to do corporate finance. Hopefully that'll be interesting for you guys. I'll try to make it as useful as possible for you. And we'll be able to check in 6 months and we'll see what's going on with inflation. And we'll see what's going on with this economic war. All right. We got no further questions. Thanks for coming out, everybody. I'll see you in a few months.
Thanks, Professor.
Professor, I do have a question. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, of course, no worries.
Is there a reason that the USA can sustain itself with such high government debt? And can that reason also apply to European markets?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay, I can describe that to you real easy. The Americans have a lot of debt, but they also have a giant economy. Right. So that's it. You owe $30 billion or 30 trillion. That sounds like a lot until you realize their GDP is like $24 trillion. So that's one thing. Secondly, in terms of the sustainability of a country's national debt, it's largely determined by who owns it. Japan has 250, 260% of GDP as their national debt, which is double what the Americans have. And they're fine. Why? Because 95% of Japan's national debt is owned by the Japanese. As long as your own people keep buying your government debt, the state simply becomes a system for redistributing wealth within society. The Venetians did that. So not unusual. Where it does get weird is when you are running your state off of other people's money. And Greece found out how problematic that can be about 10 years ago. Because when the Greek crisis hit, only about 30% of Greek national debt was owned by the Greeks. So when other people didn't want to roll it over anymore, that was it. It was over. But in places like the United States, as long as people keep buying that US government debt, they can kind of keep rolling for quite some time. So there is, I know there was some research done, Carmen Reinhardt, and I can't remember. Two economists had done some research a few years ago looking at the amount of debt to GDP before economic growth started slowing down. And they suggested that it was around 90% debt to GDP. If you were higher than that, there were problems. That has been proven to be a myth. And it totally has not worked out that way at all. We've blown right through that. It hasn't been an issue. Now, that said, take a look at a country like Lebanon. Lebanon is screwed and probably won't be a country 3-4 years from now. And I don't mean this to attack anybody's national identity. I just mean that state collapse is happening in Lebanon. And they've got a situation of about 250% debt to GDP. So what's the difference between Lebanon and Japan? Well, Japanese elites didn't rob the people of Japan. The Lebanese elites robbed the people of Lebanon and now are forcing them to turn to their various section leaders in order to be able to afford food and housing. So it's not so much the amount of debt to GDP, so much as the structure of your society that supports it. That, I think, is most important, and it's often missing from the discourse. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily a problem. Now, can America continue on the path it has been for the last 20 years? No. No, it cannot. It has been at an unreasonable and unsustainable amount of spending. America's got a lot of money in the bank. The national equity of their country is about $55 trillion. $60 trillion. So they've got lots of money. In fact, they've got enough wealth in America to pay off their whole national debt right now, even if 70% of it is owed to themselves. There's a lot of money in America. It's a very, very rich land at the end of the day. So it's unlikely to suddenly fall apart. What's much more likely is that they turn on themselves about how to spend the money. Anything else in there? Mark asked, how long do you think it will be until we get that 5-6% inflation number you talked about? That was in the news today. That was Bank of Canada's numbers today. TIF is going to raise interest rates again. The idea of it's going to be at least 3% by the end of the year. They're just going to keep raising rates every time there's a meeting, and that's just going to keep going because you can't have people that are losing 5-6% a year. If you don't get inflation under control by hitting it right now with a hammer, the end result is going to be that within 6 months, 1 year, everybody starts renegotiating their contracts. And let me tell you, I'm not going to take a 2% increase when my cost of living goes up 6%. I won't. We'll go on strike first. And I'm not alone. And I don't mean your instructors are going to screw you over as students. What I mean is that the average worker is not going to take a 1 or 2% increase when the cost of living goes up 5 and 6%. They won't. And so if we don't get inflation under control right now, workers are going to start bargaining for wage increases that are commensurate with inflation. And that's going to create a tit for tat escalation. And that's where we got inflation in the 70s. And the only way we managed to shut that down was by hammering the interest rate until it was 20-something% for a mortgage. So we don't want to go to the dark days of 1981. And that means we got to go to the grim days of 1990 instead. And that means raise interest rates.
Professor, I have another question.
Sure.
Now that Russian banks have been shut out of SWIFT, and when they try to clear their debt using rubles, the USA denied. When they tried clearing the debt using rubles, America said that this is not a valid payment.
That's right. Now, it's not just the Americans who said it. In fact, it's a violation of all their contracts in every country in which those securities were issued.
Right.
If I say I'm going to pay you 15 chickens and I say, hey, do you want some oranges instead? It's not going to fly. You're going to be like, no, man, I want chickens. That's what we dealt for chickens. So yeah, they did this.
Is it possible that they can use China and the RMB as sort of a detour and make the payments for that?
And they absolutely will. However, the Chinese are also cognizant of the fact that China's prosperity largely depends on having access to a lot of customers. And China kind of needs the West. Doesn't like to talk about it in that sense, but like there was a notion when Deng Xiaoping started them on this development path in 78 that it was going to take at least 40 or 50 years. Xi Jinping has been trying to accelerate the rate at which China can become a great power and stand on its own. He wants it to happen while he's in charge, so he can put himself in the history book to some extent. But it was well known that it was going to take a long time for China to get sufficiently wealthy and powerful. And China's not quite there yet. So while the Chinese government, while the PRC talks a good talk, the truth is that they're not really interested in picking an economic fight in the same way. They see what has happened with the Russians and they're like, we don't need that right now, because China is hoping to kind of surf a wave such that it can continue to develop its own internal economy, but it needs time for that to happen. And so it's got to keep surfing for 20, 30, 40 years. I'd say China needs at least another decade before it can start being comfortable. And that means China can't afford to pick a fight with the West right now. So they'll kind of back Putin, but they're only going to go so far.
When COVID lockdowns started and people started ripping out their supply chains from China and started shifting them to Vietnam, Thailand, and Southeast Asian countries, and also India, there was a press conference that Xi Jinping held. And he said that we have to bolster our internal economy. We have to become self-dependent. Now they're trying to start a consumer economy.
Yeah, they've been at it for quite a while. The Chinese consumer economy has been developing and growing for some time. Their consumer economy is growing very rapidly. The problem is that it's still not sufficient to deal with their productive capacity. That was part of the problem, is that in order to get rich fast, China did not say, we're going to organically grow at a particular rate so that we will manage this fine. What they did is they said, we're going to overshoot in terms of how much productive capacity we need so that we can turbocharge our growth for 20, 30 years. And then we're going to end up with too much productive capacity. And that's what China's unwinding right now, is their excess productive capacity. There's more high-speed rail line in China than the rest of the world combined, for instance. So what are they doing now? They're running high-speed rail to Tibet because I don't know what they think a lot of Tibetans are going to need high-speed rail for. But take a look at how they've built out the Belt and Road projects. Once China was done industrializing, it became, well, who else can we possibly sell our infrastructure development to? Kenya, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. Anybody else want infrastructure built? It comes with Chinese money, Chinese parts, and Chinese workers, because we have an excess of production capacity in China. They wanted to get there in 40 years instead of 60 years, so they overshot their production. So in that sense, in the broad sense, going back to China's role economically as regards the Russia conflict, China will be able to benefit from that. I think they're going to be very cautious about how much they help the Russians, because quite frankly, if I'm playing as China, I'm happy to watch Russia get weak and need me more.
They might put them in the Chinese debt trap.
Could happen, but I don't know that would be quite the case. Because at the end of the day, the debt trap, you just default and you'd be like, whatever, come get it. Sri Lanka is not in a position to do that with China because China could come get it. But let me tell you, China's not going to invade Russia to collect on its debt. So yes, okay. Big takeaways. Important to know a little bit about politics to be able to understand why countries are going to do what it is that they do. And most of the time, what countries are deciding that they're going to do, you have to think in terms of their constraints, not based in terms of what they want to do or what is morally right, but what they can do, what they must do, and what they cannot do. And that'll give us a better ability to forecast what could happen and thus position ourselves properly. Okay,
Professor.
You can already see I got people dropping out. So it's about 9:30.
Can you do more of these sessions, Professor?
I try to do like one a year kind of thing, right? Like I did COVID last year. We did COVID the year before that. Something crazy happens. I'm happy to talk about it.
Once a quarter would be amazing. Once a term.
Well, let me see what I can do. I might give you guys something at the end of 652. But we'll have to see how things develop between now and then.
All right.
Hopefully I have good news, though.
Thank you, Professor.
All right. Have a great night, everybody. I'm going to go make myself some dinner.
Good night.
Thank you for your time, Will.
Absolutely. Take care.
as well.